Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the fourth Denman Forestry Issue Series entitled Understanding Conservation Easements and Land Trust. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issue Series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate students, faculty, staff, and the public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment. The College of Forest Resources engages in a broad mission focusing on the sustainability of natural and managed environments by promoting programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban environments, and sustainable forest enterprises. This theme of sustainability will be heard many times today as we move through the program. Societal demands for both commodities and amenities from managed forests, natural wildlands, and urban and suburban landscapes have dramatically changed in recent years. Accordingly, new policy instruments, institutions, and innovative programs are needed to address these new realities. Increasing human populations, the growth of economic prosperity, mobility, and technology, as well as a change from an industrial to an information-based society have contributed to this shift. This has led to an increasing demand for the use of environmentally friendly technologies, sustainable production processes, and the protection and restoration of ecological functions and services so that future generations may enjoy the same products and amenities that we now enjoy. Our college is helping to address these new realities in many ways, one of which being today's discussion of conservation easements and land trust. Introducing new proposals to address societal demands is not an easy task. It has been and continues to be a wrenching transformation for many forest landowners in Washington state. Large shifts in wealth are occurring as a result of this paradigm shift. A commitment to resolving these issues is paramount, for we believe that the shift towards sustainable management and higher standards of forest stewardship are irreversible and will continue to grow stronger in future years. Turning to the importance of our discussion today, we need only look at a few summary statistics for Washington state. First, I wish to point out that about 38% of our state's land area is covered by commercial forest, with about 60% of this area in western Washington and 40% in eastern Washington. 44% of this commercial forest area is publicly owned and 56% privately owned. Between the years 1978 and 1980, and 1988 to 1991, all private land ownership in Washington state decreased by about 5.3%. If we look at the status of the timber inventory on these lands, we see that about 53% is publicly owned and 47% privately owned. Between 1978 and 1980 and 1988 to 1991, the timber inventory on all private lands decreased by 5.8%. And lastly, in 1999, public lands contributed only 18% of the statewide harvest, contrasted to 82% coming from private lands. These few slides begin to help us identify the problem we are here to discuss today. Private timberlands in our state are producing an increasing share of the timber harvest while simultaneously being subjected to growing pressures to provide a growing array of environmental services, amenity values, and development opportunities. We need new policy instruments and innovative programs if we are going to successfully retain these forest lands as our state continues to urbanize. Growing recognition that conservation easements and forest land trusts play a significant role in this effort is the subject of today's discussion. I wish to thank all of today's speakers as well as all of those who helped organize this event. I applaud your contributions because I believe the future of forestry and natural resource management in Washington State lies in the creation and implementation of new innovative approaches like those being discussed today. With these brief comments, I will turn the podium over to Professor James Agee, who will introduce the rest of your program. I wish you a most successful discussion.
Our panelists for this afternoon, Michelle Connor, representing the Cascade Land Conservancy, Jim Nickel, to her left, representing Forest Systems, Connie Best from Pacific Forest Trust, and David Rolfe from the Nature Conservancy. Our moderator for this section of the portion of the program is Professor Jerry Franklin from the College of Forest Resources. We call Jerry here the Dean of Forest Ecology, tremendously active in regional, national, and international issues for the past almost 40 years, with a list of awards and credits too long to even summarize. Professor Franklin.
All right. Well, we have lots of interesting questions here for our panelists, and so I think we'd probably better get right into them because we're going to have just a very short period of time. One of them that I know was a lot of interest, I've heard people talking about on break, has to do with the Evergreen Forest Trust lands, and there are two questions here. One is, what is the status of the required changes to IRS tax code for these bonds to be issued? Where are we at with regards to the legality of these bonds?
Well, I'll just preface my comments by saying that I'm a somewhat poor substitute for Gene. These negotiations have been closely held, and I may have to defer some of the questions and get back to folks on the specifics. But I can say that at this point, we have the option of going through congressional approval for the tax-exempt bonds, or we can get a private letter ruling. And our tax advisors have indicated to us that we have a very strong chance of being qualified for tax-exempt status on those revenue bonds.
Okay. The other question that this individual had, and I know there's general interest in this, will there be public access to the Evergreen Forest Trust lands?
Weyerhaeuser has maintained public access to the properties over the many years that they've been managing, and that will be incorporated into the Evergreen Trust's management of the site as well. We will manage it for ecological values, so there will be some balance, but public access will be retained.
I'd like to have the next question be one that is sort of a general question I think all of you are appropriate to respond to. This has to do with the fact that a primary source of tax income for rural counties is property taxes. And when lands are removed from tax-based or lowered in value, that reduces their ability to collect taxes and their potentially their total tax revenues. So, how do land trust organizations regard their responsibility with regards to contributing to rural county tax support and economic sustainability? So how do you individually respond to this issue of reduced tax income?
I'll start first simply to say, while I'm not going to speak to the specifics of the particular transaction, the Evergreen Forest Trust and Cascade Land Conservancy are both very sensitive to the large land base that the new Evergreen Forest at Snoqualmie provides to the community, and there will be some measures taken to make sure that the tax resources are maintained.
Normally with a conservation easement, where it's not a situation where the whole fee title is going into a nonprofit ownership, the assessed value of the property for tax purposes is often completely unchanged, particularly if we're talking about commercial timberland that's already in forest taxation status. So they already have a very low tax basis from a public policy point of view. So the easement doesn't really affect that at all. If the property is smaller and it's in a rural residential zonation or something, and you strip off development value, then you might have a reduction in the assessed value, but that would be something the landowner would need to go and discuss with the county assessor to even see if they would recognize that.
Jim, you spoke to it.
Yeah, my response is really much like Connie's. As long as it's an easement, generally we don't see a lot of tax revenue reduction to the communities because current use valuation tends to be fairly low on forest land anyways. In some locales, probably the net loser, if you will, may be the actually the state taxing agency to the extent they become some kind of severance or extractive tax related to the harvest of the timber.
I can speak to the Nature Conservancy's policy at Ellsworth Creek. Is we're taking this issue very seriously, and not only looking at the tax issue but the job implications, and we're looking at how doing forest restoration compares to doing timber a model that follows more timber harvest. So how do the jobs play out between those two? And we're going to do an analysis to look at that. As far as taxes go, when we acquire property and we take it out of a timber status and put it in a conservation status, we have to pay a tax at that point in making that change in status. We typically do not pay property taxes as a nonprofit. However, we can choose to pay fees in lieu of taxes, which we often do. And I think in this case in Willapa Bay, we are seriously looking at paying fees in lieu of taxes to the county.
Now I'm trying to group questions into groups because I think there's some that have similar or very related responses. And again, I think a couple of you at least might have responses to this, Connie and Jim particularly. Today, here's one version of it. Today my financial needs are such that entering into a conservation easement makes sense, but what if I need to cash out in the future due to family financial crisis? And here's a related one. What are the durations of the contract, and are the easements, do they have penalty clauses that could be exercised, even if limited to extreme events like a death in the family that could increase the concerns of that could potentially increase the interest of small landowners in these instruments? Once again, when landowners sell a conservation easement which limits their ability to develop or subdivide, they're reducing the way they can earn a return on the investment to timber management. Is it possible that with ESA, Endangered Species Act, or with other future changes, it could preclude their ability to manage even for the timber on the remaining lands? Or are there creative things which can be done to reduce the risk to the landowner? So those all have a common thread of, what does the person do that's concerned about being locked in with no escape? Jim, Connie? I think.
Well, I'll start. We may want to pass it back and forth.
Sure.
I guess I'll come at it from the perspective of the large landowner, because that's really the group that I can speak to from experience. Where typically our holdings tend to be 25,000 to 100,000 acres or greater in terms of the forest, and that's how we would view it. And I guess first and foremost, as a landowner, you have to go in with your eyes wide open and recognize that you're going to give up some rights, and you're going to be paid for them today. And it's part of that balance as you negotiate with whoever you're granting the easement to try to ascertain whether or not you feel you're getting fair compensation today for all of the rights that you give up in the future. And again, that's, as I mentioned in my talk, it comes down to valuation, and it's not a cut and dry decision, because I'm looking out through time and valuing the potential of development on a piece of forest land that today might be 20 miles from the nearest town, and making a determination about how much I want to get paid for giving up the opportunity to potentially get more for it in the future. I think it's somewhat different with the small landowner. They don't have quite as much flexibility, I don't believe.
Well, I think your basic point, however, holds true for any landowner. If land ownership is the proverbial bundle of sticks that appraisers talk about, where you have water rights, you may have mineral rights, you have timber rights, you have certain development rights, the zoning lets you do so many different permitted uses. When you sell any one of those rights, it happens at a moment in time and you're compensated for it. So if you sell off a lot for someone to build on, or you sell off your timber rights for another party to exercise, or you separate the mineral rights, once you do that, they're gone. You don't get to say 20 years later, I really need that timber. Or I could have, if I'd held on to that lot, I could have made a whole lot more money now. It's a transaction that occurs like any other. And I think the thing that is confusing in conservation easement is that you are selling off, for most people who enter into them, the terms of the easement mirror what they want to do on the property. They're carving away things they don't want to do. That's why they're willing to do it. And yet they are being paid through tax benefits or through cash to give up these things that are peripheral, actually, to why they have the property, to their current use, to their desired use. So you're not really giving up anything. You're getting paid for it in some respect, and presumably, because it's a voluntary thing, no one's coming and making you do the easement, you are doing it in a way that makes sense to you, using your best judgment at the time, the same as anything you do with the land. We're always changing the options for future generations and future owners by what we do on the land today. Whether you choose to harvest or not harvest, whether you put a road in someplace and it turns out to have been a really terrible place to put a road in. We're dealing with lots of those today as future landowners. All of these things, we can't foresee the future. So you make your best bet with the conservation easement, the same as you're making any other bet on your property. And you're being compensated for it. There is flexibility in easements where if what you sought to preserve in the property due to unforeseen circumstances, natural disaster or whatever, is no longer existing. Say the purpose of the easement was to protect a certain species, and that species has, due to forces beyond your control, gone extinct. Or there's old growth you're protecting that gets blown down. These are reasons that you can go back into the easement and potentially nullify it or at least amend it. So there is some flexibility having to do with the frustration of the original conservation purpose.
Give me just one bit of myth that I heard in at least one of the questions, and that is the concern that, or the implication that somehow in putting an easement in place actually elevated your risk of losing the ability to manage the property in the future due to ESA concerns or regulatory concerns. And I guess I would turn that around and challenge people to think about the fact that the easement can be a very effective way to get compensated at some level today and basically mitigate or eliminate that risk. If someone's willing to acquire a conservation easement on a piece of property that I have concern about its long-term management opportunity anyways, sort of as a prudent, rational person, I'm probably going to take their money, give them the easement, and know that I may not have gotten a dollar on a dollar relative to what I could have gotten in the future, but I don't have any risk of that dollar going away.
I can speak to 2 points about this. Easements are fundamentally flexible, and you can really tailor them to address the particular needs of the property. Typically, however, you can't use personal financial crisis or that sort of thing to terminate it. It would be something like an external ecological factor. However, that said, You can do things like enter into a term easement. You wouldn't be compensated at nearly the same value, but for instance, the Washington State's Department of Natural Resources riparian easements are 50-year easements. And so at the end of 50 years, then the landowner has a renewed option to decide what to do about the property. In the case of the evergreen forest at Snoqualmie, one of the interesting things that we've done there is it's very important for us that the Evergreen Forest Trust be a successful landowner and a successful timber harvester. They need to be able to do this and pay off the bonds for this to succeed. And so we set a base conservation level that does set aside 20,000 acres, but it has the opportunity for us to, in addition to that, ratchet up the conservation values if we're able to successfully pay off the bond and have additional revenues. But it gives the Evergreen Forest Trust the best possible chance of being successful with a sort of reduced base conservation easement to begin with.
Okay. Now this next one, I think each of you have a slightly different spin on it because you sort of deal with different approaches. Today's forest lands are being managed by non-traditional forest management organizations. Some of these organizations are managing for both economic and environmental benefits. How do you see decisions on balancing these benefits being made, presumably by these non-traditional organizations with these lands that are in trust? How do you see the public and interest groups being involved? I think maybe that's the operative interest, is how is the public and various stakeholder groups going to be involved in decisions with regards to these trust lands? I think each of you has a slightly different answer. David, you want to start?
Sure. I think in balancing economic and ecological, the Nature Conservancy of Washington doesn't have as much experience with easements, so I'm going to talk more about lands that we've acquired and hold. When we're making that balance, I think clearly the ecological side is going to win out. And part of the reasoning there is we have the ability to fund things from a number of different sources. So we can actually take a loss on say, timber revenue or something and cover that through funding from alternative sources. But you can't take that to the extreme. I think it does come down to a financial solvency thing. We have to make sure that we can stay financially solvent. In terms of balancing stakeholders and public users and things like that, I think the example of Ellsworth Creek, we've been working very closely with county commissioners to understand the issues in the county that pertain to that property. And those issues are a lot centered on jobs, and hunting is a big issue. And the Nature Conservancy can either, we have the ability to say no hunting or hunting. We have no strict policy. And in this case, we're clearly saying that the property will be open to hunting. So hopefully by really taking an assessment of the job issue and then dealing with this hunting issue, I think that we're taking at least a good step towards working with the public and the stakeholders in that area.
Connie, again, the issue of how is the balance between commodity and environment and between different stakeholder groups. How do you see that in a trust context, or easement context?
Right, and I think that's an important distinction because we're talking about two basically different strategies here today. One is where forest land is brought into ownership in fee and management by a nonprofit entity, by a charity that has as its purposes certain things, biodiversity protection or whatever. So there's the fee title, and that I think the question is, the answer is very different for that. And then there's for conservation easements. And I think the balancing act in the conservation easements, which is where we focus our work, is done actually in the easement negotiation with the landowner, where the landowner's in the driver's seat. The landowner is expressing, what goals they have, and that they're getting it is a conservation easement. It's not a management easement, if there is such a thing. So the purpose of the easement is to gain the conservation goals, but the landowner is always sensitive, and I'm sure Jim will echo this, to making sure that they aren't cutting off the branch on which they're sitting economically. As to the involvement of the public, I think that varies tremendously from situation to situation. With large easements that are being purchased with public funds, there's often quite an extensive process of building stakeholder support and getting not only agencies but elected bodies approval of the process as you go along. So there's actually many opportunities, depending on the state and the project, for the public to weigh in and other stakeholders. I think with smaller easements that are being granted by families and individuals, it tends to be a fairly private transaction, particularly if it's a charitable gift and there's not public funding involved.
Well, you're right, Connie. We're moving down the continuum here because as a landowner and investment manager, pretty clearly our primary duty is to our shareholders or our unit holders and to meet their expectations, many of which, but not all, are financial. And so we're looking at it from a financial perspective, albeit from a long-term financial perspective. And I think that's the important element, especially as a large landowner in a community. You're only able to be successful so long as you have a social license. And you can't go to the courthouse and get a social license for paying $500. You maintain your social license day in and day out in terms of how you behave and how you operate. So absolutely, there's a continuous balance between what am I going to do to maximize the performance of the property to the shareholders' near-term interests and yet protect their long-term interests. So from an involvement standpoint, there's really a number of ways the community or the public can participate, but first and foremost it is in terms of sort of granting that social license, and that takes the form of how aggressive the community is in terms of regulating your activities, how cooperative they are with you. I said it somewhat jokingly earlier, but it's whether or not they use your land as a dump or choose to have fires on it or tend to look out after your interests and try to preclude those things. So that's how the public gets involved and how they communicate whether or not you in fact have a social license beyond just the regulatory activity. But again, I mean, we make decisions first and foremost on financial criteria with a long-term perspective. And I have sort of noted that one of the questions talked about traditional and non-traditional managers. I think those lines are getting awfully blurred in today's society. I'm not sure who a traditional versus a non-traditional is anymore.
I'd like to clarify with respect to the Evergreen Forested Snoqualmie, the ownership structure. While we did create, Cascade Land Conservancy did create the Evergreen Forest Trust. Evergreen Forest Trust is now its own independent 501c3 entity. One of the fundamental unique factors of this transaction is that we've separated the conservation easement ownership, which will be held by Cascade Land Conservancy, and the management of the forest, which will be undertaken by Evergreen Forest Trust in consultation with the Campbell Group. Evergreen Forest Trust, while it has goals for habitat management, also has this financial obligation to pay off the bonds. One of our jobs at Cascade Land Conservancy will to make sure that they honor their ecological commitments. In addition, because of its proximity to Seattle and its long use by the public, I'm sure there will be extensive stakeholder involvement.
That's great. The responses remind me of what I tell my students at the beginning of almost every class, which is forestry is a social science. And in response to Jim's comment that no practice, or for that matter instrument, that is not socially acceptable is not sustainable. So, okay, couple of fairly interesting questions here in terms of, I'm really going to be curious to see what you do with these. And again, this one is one that is apropos probably all of you, even though it focuses on the local situation. In western Washington, much of the conservation, easement, and acquisition focus has been on near urban areas, such as the Mountain to Sound Greenway and now the Snoqualmie Forest. Do you think that these near urban forests provide the same wildlife and wilderness qualities as remote forests? Are these efforts driven more by human recreation needs or environmental protection? I think perhaps the last question is the more relevant, but anybody care to jump in on that one? Michelle, you want to start?
Sure, I'll give it a go. I mean, first of all, I think it's fundamentally important to us, if we're going to manage our faraway wild places, that we manage our close-to-home wild places. I think a fundamental test for us is if we can keep salmon in our systems within the Northwest, then we'll really have started to integrate our ecosystem functions into our built environments. And I think maintaining both these working forests, which provide jobs and provide resources for industry and also provide habitat and recreational values for people, it's all very intertwined. As you say, it's a social science. I don't think that we've been working exclusively on these lands in Washington State would be the second thing that I would say. There are diverse groups working on dealing with checkerboard issues, buying in holdings up in the wilderness areas, and I think that this bond tool will be something that can be used both in urban and near urban environments and also in some of our further away environments and deal with very large tracts of forest land.
David, you'd probably be very appropriate to respond to this.
Yeah, I could speak. The Nature Conservancy is a very science-driven organization that the way we select where we work is driven through a process called eco-regional planning, where it's a very science-driven process that tries to identify areas that are going to protect the biological diversity of an ecoregion. And if you look at distribution of biological diversity, particularly in areas like the Northwest, I think you quickly pick up that a lot of it is in lower elevation areas. And the reason we're working in places like Ellsworth Creek and the Skagit River is because this science-driven ecoregional planning process has driven us to those places that hold those critical biological systems that are still in a very healthy condition. So that's where we've chosen to focus first. I think it's just, different organizations have different focuses and work at things from different angles. We may actually use the same techniques in those different areas.
Okay. Jim, Connie, you want to respond to recreation versus function, ecological function as the goal?
I guess first and foremost, playing junior social scientist, I doubt that it's either or, but it's a combination of both. And what I see it as, and what we see it day in and day out in terms of lands we manage, it's a social triage. Society has looked at where they think that the worst bleeding artery is in terms of their value system, and that's where they're putting their activity and their energy. To the extent that it's lowland forest on the urban interface, it's probably because they have an affinity with that property, whether they recreate on it or what have you. And again, that I think that provides some insight into the power of creating a relationship and a bond and interaction between society broadly and the ownership of the forest land. So it may sound like a broken record, but it comes back to the original point that I talked about is the more we can build that linkage, I think the stronger we're going to be with respect to working through issues on the forest.
I think everyone has been very eloquent.
Okay.
I could add one more comment to that, which is if you look at the Snoqualmie Forest, Jean didn't really mention it, but that's where people have talked about I-605 going. There's a certain urgency. Sprawl happens, and we can't guarantee the zoning will stay the same or that the pressures on the landscape will stay the same. And so by putting that into working forest and ensuring that it's in working forest, we're deciding how our growth will continue in the county.
Couple of quick ones, maybe more direct. And maybe, Jim, I'll throw you this one. Will the partners be developing methods to leverage market value of harvested timber? I.e., the question is with these kinds of programs involving easements, will it be used as a marketing tool in terms of the timber products coming from these areas? The comparison is made with, quote, Puget Sound fresh, unquote, used by farmers in order to improve the market for timber, especially large diameter timber. So actually, Jim and Michelle would.
The short answer is I don't know. But it is certainly, there's an opportunity to integrate the easement process and any restrictions in terms or changes in management activity with your with any efforts you have going on to either be certified, have a certified forest, irrespective of which of the various certification programs you go through. So there may be some linkage there, but it's certainly not something that we've considered.
I think it's a great idea. I don't know how far we've gone with those kind of considerations at this point, but certainly anything that we can do to let the consumer make a wise choice, especially in the Puget Sound region, about what they're buying.
Certainly, it would seem like an opportunity to tie some of these programs in with green certification.
Right, sort of certification plus, because you know
Right.
that the wood from that property is going to genuinely be sustainable, because that property is going to stay in forest use.
Although I have to, observe from a landowner's perspective who's actively selling wood, the marketplace is yet to speak with respect to its willingness to pay an additional amount for certified wood. So I think that's an open question.
A question that's sort of near and dear to the academics. What are the projected employment opportunities associated with implementing conservation easements and land trusts? Is this going to be an opportunity for our graduates?
You bet.
Low pay.
It's definitely, a growing sector. And I think one of the areas where it's going to grow enormously over the next decade is not just in the field of identifying the property to be conserved or negotiating the conservation easements, but actually in stewarding all those interests in property. So the stewardship function is one that land trusts are going to be focusing on increasingly, and therefore there'll be many more jobs in that regard, particularly for graduates of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources.
All right.
I would agree. I think there's a lot of job opportunities. I'm finding that in working at the large landscape level and doing things like forest restoration, there are just so many questions that we have no idea what the answer is, that we continually have to hire people or use consultants or graduate students to try to answer some of those questions. And I think a lot of professionals in the forestry industry are having to learn completely new tools that they're applying in the woods, things like geographic information systems and GIS, and learning how to survey for fish, and a lot of these things that I think there's definitely a job market out there.
In addition, I think the tax-exempt bond resource, that as the bonds are paid down and there's more money available for environmental restoration, that's definitely a new income stream to graduate students.
All right. Last question we've got time for. I'm thinking particularly Jim and Connie might be individuals that could give a response to this. I'm most curious. I respond to this question myself, and I'm looking for new material. This is a question. According to a United Nations report, the United States now consumes more timber than it produces. If forest land is transferred from intensive timber production to more conservative management, will this not cause the U.S. demand to move to import timber from other countries, therefore exporting the environmental impacts of timber production?
I just want to jump in and say, if Snoqualmie Forest went over to suburbs, there'd be a lot less timber harvest off it.
Which I think is a very good point in general. The beauty of conservation easements that we've been talking about today is that they're on managed forests. So they are forests that will be around and be supplying timber theoretically in perpetuity. So I don't think we're exporting the problem And I think that the market forces that are at work in terms of supply and demand of fiber in the United States are global, no matter how you look at them. They are global. I think the U.S. has tremendous opportunities through technology that we've already seen in increasing fiber yields. The question is, do all forests need to be managed intensively, or is there in fact an opportunity to manage extensively and manage for multiple resources? And I think that to me is the bigger challenge, is will there be any extensively managed forests, or are we only going to have intensive fiber plantations in suburbs?
Jim, you want to comment on this? Are we just exporting our consumption?
Well, I have to really, Connie and I find ourselves agreeing, I think, quite often. I mean, we're operating in a global marketplace, and are we exporting it? And no, I don't think so. Yes, we're a net importer of wood fiber, and I think the question will be, on the acreage that we do have, is there a way to generate more wood fiber, to Connie's point, and is there a way to do it without completely undermining the appropriate interests of some lands that need to be preserved? I mean, there's a number of areas in this country where there are working forests, where there's opportunities and probably good rationale for setting some of that ground aside. Likewise, there's a lot of property in this country that's undermanaged, and my perspective is that's in part a sort of an artifact of the regulatory approaches we've used in the past, and we've used a pretty blunt hammer in a lot of cases to try to go through our regulatory process. But if we look out into the future and we look at demand around the globe, I think most studies, most projections indicate that there's a much higher rate of growth for demand of wood fiber outside of this country than inside the country. So the demand is going to be there. And we look at places like Uruguay, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, and see the tremendous amount of forest establishment that's going on. I think it's hard pressed to put it on the U.S. to have caused or to be exporting its challenges. I think the world's doing a pretty good job of putting demands on the forest resource on its own without our help.
I think another answer to this question is if you look at work done by Bruce Lipke and some others. I've just read a paper from the Coast Range Association where they've modeled if you actually change the forest management paradigm to start working with longer rotations, you can actually increase the amount of board feet coming out of the forest while also increasing the ecological value.
Okay, well, I think our panel's done a good job, so why don't you just go ahead and stay there, and we'll have Jim finish up.
Thank you, panel, and thank you, Jerry. I just have a few concluding comments here. Probably the largest conceptual issue that we face in forestry in the future is this issue of sustainability. I know that there's not a single definition of sustainability. In fact, professors could probably argue about what that means all the time. But clearly it requires forest land and forests and the ability to successfully manage them over the long term. And our real challenge is how to achieve these objectives in a really dynamic environment. There's really kind of no light at the end of the tunnel where we track through the tunnel and we get to the end and we're there. It's a moving target. It's always going to be changing. We have a dynamic socio-economic environment, both in terms of investment climate, tax laws, which may be in place today or may be in place next month, that obviously are going to impact at least one of the projects that we talked about today. And also public values about landscapes, how people view the kinds of activities that are occurring out on forests. We also have a series of ecological challenges. Not only in terms of species and community and ecosystem preservation, but how to deal with ecological surprise in a dynamic environment. Things like natural disturbances, fire, insects, disease, as well as harvest. We focused on harvest, but there are a lot of other things going on in these changing environments. So how do we balance these things? Well, We probably never will. But I think we can make some tremendous progress. It's clear that conservation easements make great sense for both investment-oriented and conservation-oriented folks. And in many cases, these folks are the same people. In other cases, they may not be. These opportunities provide us great flexibility to avoid excessive ecological and economic risk. They also help to reduce conflicts between investment and stewardship values. But they're going to require very innovative ecological planning and economic planning. And I think today our presentations and our panelists have provided some either exciting proposals or completed projects that kind of give you a template for what may be coming into the future. Land trusts and conservation easements have been important. And they're emerging clearly as a set of tools that are even going to be more important in the future. We hope that this series has increased your understanding of this emerging set of tools to increase forest sustainability. And very briefly, I'd like to thank our panel, Michelle Connor and Jean DeVernoy of the Cascade Land Conservancy, Jim Nickel from Forest Systems Incorporated, Connie Best from Pacific Forest Trust, and David Rolfe from the Nature Conservancy, and our panel moderator, Dr. Jerry Franklin. And also the Denman Endowment, which helped finance the event that we had today.